By 1850, half of the adult men of Martha's Vineyard were at sea at any given moment, and Vineyard-born captains commanded roughly 150 whaling ships out of New Bedford, nearly a fifth of the entire American whaling fleet. On North Water Street in Edgartown, more than 100 of their mansions went up, most of them inside a single boom decade. 1835 to 1845. Not over a lifetime, not over a generation, 10 years. The names on the harbor changed after the oil money did. Kennedy's arrived by mid-century, then Clinton's, then a director named Spielberg who came in 1974 to film a shark and left behind an industry still running tour boats 50 years later. Then Obama's, who came as vacationers and stayed as landowners on 28.5 acres of their own. Different centuries, different fortunes. The same 7-mile crossing from the mainland, made by everyone who ever decided this island was worth having. 2 sets of names built Martha's Vineyard's fortune, a century and a half apart. Neither set is the one that ends up priced out when the money moves back in. Chapter 1. The Hand-Shaped Island. The Wampanoag called it Noepe, the land between the streams. And they had lived on it for thousands of years before anyone thought to give it another name. Geologically, it is a leftover, a moraine dropped by a retreating glacier some 20,000 years earlier, a low ridge of clay and sand and glacial till that never fully decided what shape it wanted to be. Roughly 100 square miles, 7 miles across the sound from Cape Cod at the nearest point, its outline on a map resembles an open hand, fingers of land splayed toward the Atlantic. 6 towns sit across that hand, and the island splits, unofficially but permanently, into 2 halves that will keep splitting for the next 300 years. Down Island, Edgartown, Oak Bluffs, Vineyard Haven, took the harbors, the traffic, the money. Up Island, West Tisbury, Chilmark, Aquina, took the wind, the moorland, the long delay. The moraine tells its age in the land's texture. Kettle ponds, where buried ice melted out of the till, clay bluffs banded ochre and rust, moorland bent permanently landward by a wind that never stops. Boulders the ice carried from bedrock to the north, sites scattered through what would become pasture, too heavy to move. In 1602, an English navigator named Bartholomew Gosnold sailed along the southern coast and noted the wild grapevines running thick across the clay bluffs, tangled over scrub oak and stunted pine, more of them than he had counted on any coast he had charted. The voyage that brought him there had already logged weeks of open Atlantic crossing and cautious approach to an unfamiliar shore, the crew watching the tree line for smoke. He had an infant daughter at home named Martha. He gave the island her name, and the grapes stayed where they were, growing over bluffs that would carry that name for the rest of recorded time. Not a saint's name settled onto that coastline, and not a king's. A baby's did, attached to a wall of fruit she would never see. Contact came slow, and it came for a while, without the violence that defined so much of the region around it. On October 13th, 1641, Thomas Mayhew bought Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and the Elizabeth Islands from the English patent holders, who claimed them on paper, for a sum small enough that it barely survives intact in the record. Roughly 3,000 Wampanoag people were already living across the island's hand-shaped acreage when the deed was signed, fishing its ponds, farming its clearings, holding a civilization the paperwork did not acknowledge and could not erase. Their villages moved with the seasons, closer to the shore in warm months for the fishing and the shellfish beds, drawn inland when the weather turned. They planted corn, beans, and squash together in the same mounded earth, and strung wampum cut from local shell into belts that recorded agreements no written page yet existed to replace. Mayhew's son came soon after. Thomas Mayhew, Jr. arrived on the island in 1642, a young missionary with a commission to convert the Wampanoag, and a method almost nobody else in New England was using. He learned their language, not a phrasebook version, not the trader's pigeon used up and down the coast, but the grammar itself, well enough to preach in it, well enough to translate in it, well enough that converts came to him instead of being dragged. He preached first in borrowed spaces, a sachem's wetu, or a cleared field, long before any meeting house existed to hold a congregation. He did not burn what he did not understand. He asked. It made him, for a working missionary in the 1640s, close to alone. What grew out of that decade of uneasy coexistence was not doctrine. It was a transaction so small neither side recorded it as history. Wampanoag families on the island already understood the whales that came close to shore, the right whales that stranded on the shoals, the pods that ran near enough to the beach to be seen from a bluff at dawn. And they knew how to take one down, how to cut it, how to render the blubber into oil over a fire built right there on the sand. They showed the English how it was done. Nobody involved in that first boiling fire on the beach, Wampanoag or English, had any way of knowing what they were standing next to. Chapter 2. The First Iron. 2 generations after that first boiling fire on the beach, the transaction had turned into a career, and a lucrative one. The boat steerer was the man who stood in the bow of a whaleboat, 6 oarsmen behind him, and threw the first iron into a sperm whale at a distance close enough to see the animal's eye, before the harpoon left his hand. Miss, and the boat lost the whale, and likely the day's wage with it. Hit, and the boat was fastened to 60 tons of animal that could tow it for miles, or take it under without warning. Whaling captains sailing out of Edgartown and New Bedford learned to recruit up island by name, seeking out Aquina Wampanoag men whose fathers and grandfathers had cut whales on the sand at Gay Head. Men who brought 3 things no captain could train into a crew: a fisherman's patience, a marksman's stillness, and an intimacy with open water that the ship owners themselves did not have. A skilled boat steerer could be worth more to a 3-year voyage than the mate standing behind him. He had earned the position climbing the same ladder every man aboard climbed, green hand to boat steerer to mate, and only on a later voyage of his own, to the captain's cabin aft. The shore whaling of the previous generation, small boats launched straight off the beach, chasing right whales that stranded close enough to see from a bluff at dawn, gave way in the early 1800s to something larger and colder. Ships now hunted the sperm whale, a deep-water animal that did not strand conveniently on the shoals, and the industry built around it became the engine of the island's entire economy. A voyage sailed provisioned for years at a stretch: salt beef, hardtack, water casks lashed below. And once a whale was killed and towed alongside, its blubber was boiled down at sea in the try-works. A brick furnace bolted to the deck itself so the oil came home fit for market rather than rotting raw in the hold. It paid the carpenters who built the boats, the coopers who built the casks, the merchants who financed the voyages, and the wives who ran households and farms alone for years at a stretch. By 1850, roughly half of the island's adult men were at sea, on a whaling voyage at any given moment. The island did not merely profit from whaling, it emptied into it. Edgartown became the capital of this new economy, its harbor lined with the trades the industry required: ship chandleries stocked with rope, canvas, and lamp oil, sail lofts where sailcloth was cut and stitched by the mile, cooperages turning out the barrels that would carry oil home from 3 oceans. Across the water, New Bedford had grown into something larger still, a mainland port of wharves and refineries that processed oil by the barrel load and financed ships that vineyard captains were only too glad to sail. Voyages ran 3 to 4 years at a stretch, long enough for a boy to leave as a green hand and return a man, chasing sperm whales as far as the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Some ships did not come home on schedule. Some did not come home at all. The peak came in the 1840s and 1850s. In those 2 decades, Edgartown alone logged 111 whaling voyages, sailed on 33 ships, and in one especially fat year, the town's catch was valued at $90,000, Oil and whalebone converted into cash faster than any other trade on the island had ever managed. Vineyard-born captains, meanwhile, commanded something closer to 150 vessels sailing out of New Bedford. The 150 ships already weighed in the telling of this story, amounting to nearly a fifth of the entire American whaling fleet. An island a few miles wide was, by these numbers, running close to a fifth of a national industry. A single successful voyage, 3 years at sea, a hold full of oil, a market hungry enough to pay for it, could net a captain enough money to build a mansion outright. No mortgage, no note, no bank standing between the money and the house. By the late 1840s, a growing number of Edgartown men had exactly that much money, sitting freshly landed in their accounts, with nowhere yet to put it. That problem would not last long. Chapter 3. The Street That Money Built. The money did not sit long. Between 1835 and 1845, Edgartown converts whale oil into architecture at a pace no other decade on the island will match. More than 100 captains' houses rise along North Water Street and its neighboring lanes, built by men who commanded ships, not banks, and who paid for the work the way they paid for provisions, in full before the job was finished. The style is federal, then Greek revival as the decade wears on. Symmetrical facades, fan lights over the doors, columns borrowed from a temple language that had nothing to do with whaling and everything to do with what whaling money wanted to say about itself. Each house faces the harbor. That detail is not decorative. Picture the street as it stands by 1845. Clapboard houses in white and pale yellow run in an unbroken line above the water, each one topped by a railed platform. A widow's walk, where a captain's wife could stand and scan the horizon for a sail that might be her husband's, 3 years after he had left. The houses share a scale, a palette, a posture toward the sea, built within 1 decade by men who had all done the same thing to get rich. Front doors carry brass fittings shipped from the same suppliers. Fences enclose gardens planted with species carried home in a ship's hold. By the time the boom decade ends, North Water Street will stand as one of the most complete, unbroken rows of sea captain architecture anywhere in New England, a single street recording a single trade at its single richest moment. The money does not spread evenly across the island. It gathers at the harbor towns, Edgartown first, Vineyard Haven behind it, and it does not travel up island. Chilmark and Aquina stay what they had been before the whaling fleet made anyone rich. Farming country and fishing coves, home to Wampanoag families and to English farming stock who had never held a harpoon and never would. The split laid down in the island's earliest years, low-lying farmland to the west against a harbor economy to the east, hardens now into something closer to permanent. 2 centuries later, the same geography will still separate the island's wealthiest addresses from its quietest ones. Whaling did not create that division. It financed it. The fortune North Water Street represents does not have a second chapter. 2 forces ended inside a single generation. The first arrives with the Civil War, when Confederate commerce raiders go hunting for the Union's whaling fleet specifically because it sails undefended, unarmed, built for oil, and not for combat. CSS Shenandoah alone burns and captures whaling ships across 2 oceans in 1865, some of them months after the war on land has already ended, word not yet having reached captains anchored in the Arctic. The second force arrives without a single shot fired. In 1859, a well driller in Pennsylvania strikes petroleum, and over the following decades, a fuel pumped from the ground undercuts a fuel hunted at sea in every way that matters to a market: price, supply, and the safety of the men producing it. Whale oil does not vanish overnight. It simply stops being the only answer, then stops being the cheap one. And the industry that built North Water Street spends the rest of the century in a decline no single captain can outrun with a faster ship or a longer voyage. Edgartown does not become a ruin. It becomes something quieter than that. a town of fine houses and idle wharves, its money already spent and its trade already gone. The island does not stay empty of purpose for long. Within a decade, an entirely different visitor starts arriving by the boatload, not for oil and not for cargo. And this one comes carrying a hymnal instead of a harpoon. Chapter 4. The Grove that replaced the wharf. Jeremiah Pease is not a whaling captain, and he does not need to be. He is an Edgartown Methodist, a diarist by habit, a man who keeps ledgers on the weather, the tides, and the state of his own soul with the same flat precision. In the summer of 1835, he leases half an acre of Oak Grove on the island's north shore, gathers 6 fellow parishioners, and pitches 9 tents in a clearing shaded by scrub oak and locust. The lease is a modest transaction, a few dollars for a patch of scrubland nobody else wants. Pease has no way of knowing that this half-acre will outlast every counting house on Edgartown's main street. The first meeting draws more people than the organizers can seat, feed, or shelter. Word travels by boat and by letter, and worshipers arrive from New Bedford, from Nantucket, from as far as Boston, carrying their own canvas and their own provisions. 9 tents cannot hold a congregation that keeps doubling. Within a few seasons, the encampment sprawls past its original half-acre, spilling into the surrounding oak in rows and crescents, each family staking its own small plot for the week of the meeting. By 1855, the count stands at 200 tents, pitched in concentric rings around a central preaching stand, the ground now known by its own name, Wesleyan Grove. The economics are unlike anything the whaling trade produced. No oil, no barrels, no 6,000-mile voyages against the risk of a ship lost with all hands. Just a week's lease, a canvas roof, and a congregation that returns every summer with the reliability of the tide itself. The Civil War does not burn Wesleyan Grove the way war burns treasuries and shipping lanes elsewhere on the island's ledger. It starves it of material instead. Canvas grows scarce and expensive as the mills that once supplied tents turn their output toward uniforms and tarpaulins for the Union Army. The campers do not stop coming. They rebuild instead, replacing canvas walls with wood frame cottages cut in the same footprint as the tents they replace, doors and windows fitted where tent flaps used to hang. Scarcity, in this instance, produces not ruin, but carpentry. The wooden cottages multiply faster than the tents ever did. By 1880, the Grove counts 500 of them, packed onto narrow lanes barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, each one trimmed with scrollwork and gable ornament that grows more elaborate with every rebuilding season. The settlement takes a new name that year, Cottage City, incorporated and self-governing. A town built entirely on the logic of a religious lease that started with 9 canvas roofs and 6 parishioners. At the center of it stands the Tabernacle, raised in 1879, an open-air structure of iron trusswork tall enough to shelter thousands under its ribs without a single wall to block the sea air. It replaces the wooden preaching stand that served the Grove for 4 decades, and it does not fall out of use the way old structures often do on this island. It still hosts services every summer, its iron frame carrying hymns across the same ground where Pease once pitched his half-acre of tents. More than 300 of the cottages survive intact today, their trim repainted in the same pinks, blues, and yellows that gave them the name gingerbread, packed onto the same 36 acres Pease's congregation first cleared. The town around them takes yet another name in 1907, shedding Cottage City for something that will outlast even that: Oak Bluffs. The mansions of Edgartown were built on oil pulled from the bodies of whales, hunted across 3 oceans. The cottages of Oak Bluffs are built on a lease, a tent, and a congregation that keeps returning. Both are real estate. Only one of them is about to draw a community that no camp meeting organizer in 1835 could have pictured standing on that half-acre of oak grove. Chapter 5. The Inkwell and the Island of Presidents. The camp meeting drew a community. Starting in the 1890s, Oak Bluffs draws another, and this one comes to stay. It becomes one of the first African-American seaside resort communities in the United States, built not by a single founder, but by hundreds of individual decisions, repeated year after year. Many of its earliest black residents first set foot on the island as domestic servants, hired to cook and clean for the white summer families filling the gingerbread cottages. Some of them save enough to buy a cottage of their own, often after years of setting aside wages earned in service to the families who summer a few streets away. A cottage bought in this era rarely changes hands again outside the family. It is passed down generation to generation, becoming less a piece of real estate than an inheritance with a porch and a name. The ledger of Oak Bluff's real estate begins to hold names that would not have appeared in it a generation earlier. By the 1920s, black homeowners in Oak Bluffs are renting rooms to vacationers arriving from Boston, from New York, from Philadelphia. The arrangement compounds. A homeowner with a spare room becomes in effect a boarding house keeper, and guests return to the same porch summer after summer. Word of a reliable room having traveled through churches, lodges, and workplaces in the cities to the north long before any advertisement could have reached the same people. By the mid-1950s, Oak Bluffs is a full-fledged black resort community, drawing visitors from across the country to a stretch of beach that would come to carry the weight of that history in its name. White residents once called the town beach the Inkwell, a slur aimed at the color of the swimmers gathered there. The name does not disappear. The black community that gathers there year after year takes it and keeps it, and it becomes theirs. In the 1940s, a group of swimmers, mostly black, begins meeting at Inkwell Beach for a morning swim, regardless of the weather or the season. They call themselves the Polar Bear Club. The club is still swimming there today, more than 80 years of mornings, unbroken. By the middle of the 20th century, a new name arrives on the island, and it changes what the island is understood to be. The Kennedy family begins summering on Martha's Vineyard, and where the Kennedys go, the national press and the political class follow behind them. The island offers something Washington and Boston cannot: distance, a limited number of ferries controlling who arrives, and a summer population long practiced at protecting its own privacy. There is no paparazzi apparatus built for this pursuit yet, and proximity to Boston and Washington keeps the arrangement practical, close enough for a quick return if the government requires it, far enough for a governing class to behave for a few weeks, like a family on vacation rather than a family in power. It was a whaling port. It became a religious retreat. It is becoming a discreet retreat for the country's political elite, a place where power spends its summers out of view of the cameras it commands the rest of the year. Late on the night of July 18, 1969, Senator Ted Kennedy drives a car off the Dyke Bridge on Chappaquiddick, the small island reachable by a short ferry crossing from Edgartown's harbor. In the car with him is Mary Jo Kopechne, 28 years old, a campaign aide who had worked on Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign and had come to the island that weekend for a reunion of former campaign staff. The car goes into the water. Kopechne is trapped inside and drowns. Kennedy escapes the car. He does not report the crash to authorities for more than 10 hours. He later pleads guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. The episode follows him for the rest of his career, and it ends, for good, any realistic path he had to the presidency. The island keeps its reputation for discretion, even as this becomes the most public failure of it. Within a decade, the water off Chappaquiddick will draw very different cameras, pointed at an entirely different story. Chapter 6. The Shark, the Presidents, and the Price of Being Seen. In May of 1974, the water returns to the island's story, though this time by design rather than tragedy. A young director named Steven Spielberg, still years from the name that will define a generation of American film, arrives on Martha's Vineyard to shoot a picture about a fictional resort town called Amity, terrorized by something unseen beneath the surface: The production is famously troubled, mechanical sharks that will not submerge, schedules that balloon from 55 days to 159. The crew nicknames the malfunctioning prop Bruce after Spielberg's own lawyer, and the machine's refusal to cooperate becomes local legend on its own terms, the pneumatic hoses fouling in salt water faster than anyone in California had accounted for. Out of that failure comes an improvised line, delivered almost as an aside, that will outlive the picture itself. "We're going to need a bigger boat," a sentence that passes into the general vocabulary of American film long after most people have forgotten which movie it came from. The island itself performs without complaint. Edgartown's harbor becomes Amity's waterfront. The fishing hamlet of Menemsha, with its weathered docks and lobster shacks, becomes Amity's working shore. Filming runs through October, 5 months of cameras and crews occupying a town that has spent 2 centuries either whaling, fishing, or hosting the wealthy, and now, briefly, makes movies. The timing works in the island's favor. Edgartown is in an economic slump that year, its summer trade thinner than the merchants would like, and the production arrives less as an intrusion than as a windfall. Islanders are hired by the hundreds. As extras, boat handlers, carpenters, drivers, anyone willing to stand in a crowd scene or haul equipment down to the water. Local businesses that had braced for a quiet season instead spend the summer feeding and housing a film crew. When the picture is released the following year, it becomes the highest-grossing film ever made to that point. And audiences who have never heard of Martha's Vineyard begin arriving by ferry to find the real Amity. They are, of course, looking for a town that only exists on a soundstage of the imagination, built out of real docks and real water. They find enough of it to keep coming back. 50 years on, the arrangement has calcified into permanent local industry. Guided tours now walk visitors through the filming locations block by block, pointing out which bench, which storefront, which stretch of beach belongs to the movie, rather than to the town's own history. An annual anniversary celebration draws a self-described community of devoted fans who call themselves fanatics, some crossing oceans for the occasion, and a museum exhibit preserves the production's ephemera under glass. A film about a monster in the water has outlived its own novelty and become instead a fixture of the island's economy. Proof that Martha's Vineyard's oldest talent, turning outside attention into local income, still works. The island's gravitational pull only strengthens in the decades that follow. Barack and Michelle Obama begin vacationing there during his presidency, drawn by the same discretion and scenery that drew the Kennedys before them, and later purchase a 28.5-acre estate on its shores. Bill and Hillary Clinton remain regular visitors as well, part of a pattern by then so familiar that a vineyard summer functions almost as a credential. Each arrival brings its own weather. Motorcades on 2-lane roads built for bicycles, a traveling press pool billeted in island inns, real estate agents fielding calls from buyers who have never set foot on the vineyard but want, suddenly, to own a piece of whatever the cameras keep pointing at. Property listings near the summer compounds draw interest disproportionate to their size, and island newspapers that once covered whaling logs now run items on which senator dined where. By the 2000s, no summer address in America carries more recognition than Martha's Vineyard. A small island off Cape Cod that has, across a century, become shorthand for a specific type of American arrival. Underneath the recognition, something else is hardening. Local officials and tribal leaders have begun warning that outside money is buying the island faster than the people who live on it can hold their ground. A Wampanoag tribal council chair puts it without ceremony. The millionaires and billionaires are buying us out. The tour buses keep running on schedule. The warning does not stop them. Chapter 7. The Island That Cannot Afford Itself. By the early 2020s, the median home price on Martha's Vineyard has crossed $1.5 million. It does not stop there. Within a few years, it pushes past $2 million, a figure that would have seemed absurd to the fishing families and farmhands who built the island's original economy. Only about 40% of the housing stock remains available for year-round occupancy. The rest sits empty for most of the calendar, held by owners who arrive for 6 weeks in summer and leave the rest of the year to caretakers and closed shutters. Between what a year-round island worker earns and what island housing costs, the gap has widened past $1 million. The short-term rental market accelerates the shortage on its own terms. Digital booking platforms make this shift possible at a scale the island has never seen before. Airbnb and VRBO, both built in the years after 2008, turn a spare bedroom or an entire cottage into a transaction completed in minutes, with no local broker involved. Roughly 1/5 of the island's homes now operate as vacation rentals, averaging around $930 a night. An owner needs only about 2 nights of bookings a month to match what a full year-round lease would bring in. Each season, that math pulls another cluster of houses out of the pool available to teachers, plumbers, restaurant cooks, and the ferry crews who keep the island running. The workforce does not leave the island so much as it is priced out of sleeping in it. Church basements begin to fill the gap the market leaves behind. A winter emergency shelter, run out of a rotation of island churches, now opens every year for residents who cannot find stable housing at any price. The shelter is not a program with an end date written into it. It is a fixture, is a fiction, renewed each December because the condition beneath it renews itself with equal reliability. On September 14, 2022, the island becomes the stage for an event with no connection to its own housing math and every connection to its reputation as a haven for the powerful. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis arranges for planes carrying about 50 asylum seekers, most of them from Venezuela, to fly from Texas to Martha's Vineyard unannounced. The migrants arrive with no advance notice to the island, no coordination with local officials, and no plan for shelter beyond what they carry in their hands. Island churches open their doors within hours of the plane's landing. Word passes through the island's year-round community by phone and by hand faster than any official channel can move. Restaurant owners open their kitchens after closing hours, and off-duty ferry workers help carry luggage and children from the tarmac to the waiting vans. Volunteers organize food and blankets overnight, and the Massachusetts National Guard is called in to help manage food, shelter, and translation for people who speak little English and know nothing about where they have been sent. Within days, the flights become a national political flashpoint, covered on every network and debated on the floor of Congress. The migrants later file a lawsuit against DeSantis and the state of Florida, alleging they were misled about their destination and its purpose. The island that markets its distance from the mainland's problems spends that week absorbing one of the mainland's largest problems on roughly 48 hours' notice. Nobody involved in arranging the flight consulted the people who would have to receive it. Underneath all of it, the ground itself is running out on its own schedule. At Aquina, the island's western tip, cliffs of red and gray clay have faced the open Atlantic for millions of years, and the ocean has never stopped working on them. The clay runs in visible bands of rust, ochre, and pale gray, stacked in layers that record tens of thousands of years of sediment laid down long before the island took its current shape. Nothing about the cliff face stays fixed. The bluffs retreat at a rate of roughly 2 feet a year, sometimes more, as waves and rain strip the soft clay away layer by layer. The Gayhead Lighthouse has stood at the edge of those cliffs since 1856, its light guiding ships past the shoals below. By 2014, only 46 feet separated the 160-year-old tower from the crumbling edge of the bluff. A single severe storm can strip away 20 feet of cliff face in one night. Chapter 8. The Cost of Staying. In 2015, engineers answer the countdown that closed the previous chapter. Aquina's Gayhead Light, Brick since 1856, is lifted off its foundation and set onto steel rails threaded with hydraulic pistons. Over 2 years, at a cost of $3.5 million, the entire tower, masonry, lantern room, lens, is walked 129 feet inland, a few feet at a time, away from the edge that had been chasing it for a century and a half. No section of the structure is dismantled for the move. It travels whole, and it arrives whole. The relocated light reopens to the public on August 11, 2015, roughly 180 feet from the cliff edge it had once stood 46 feet from. At current rates of erosion, engineers project the new site will hold for approximately 150 years. The beam still turns over Vineyard Sound each night on the same rotation it has kept since the 19th century. Ships still read it as a warning. The cliffs it warns them away from keep eroding regardless. Those cliffs are Wampanoag land, and have been since long before any lighthouse stood on them. The Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head today stewards more than 34,000 acres on and around the island, ground held onto through 4 centuries in which almost everything else on Martha's Vineyard changed hands. The light moved. The claim beneath it did not. Down island, in Edgartown, the whaling captain's mansions on North Water Street still stand in white rows facing the harbor. Restored, replumbed, resold, they are privately owned now, several worth many millions of dollars, occupied for a handful of weeks each summer and shuttered the rest of the year. Their widows' walks still look out over water that no longer carries a single whaling ship. The wealth they were built to display has changed hands, not form. In Oak Bluffs, the Flying Horses Carousel still turns. Built in 1876, it carries children past the same hand-carved wooden horses, glass eyes, real horsehair manes, a brass ring still swinging within reach of an outstretched arm. A short walk from it, the tabernacle still fills with a congregation every summer, its 1879 ironwork holding the same open-sided shape it held the year it went up. More than 300 gingerbread cottages ring it on the same 36 acres, their fretwork trim repainted, but their frames still tracing the canvas tents they replaced. The camp meeting town took the name Oak Bluffs in 1907 and never stopped meeting. Down the shoreline, at Inkwell Beach, the Polar Bear Club still gathers every morning to swim, a ritual now more than 80 years unbroken. It is a small, cold, daily habit, and it is also a living line back through more than a century of black families who built a vacation life on this stretch of sand when few other beaches in the country would have them. The water has not changed. Who was welcome in it took much longer to. The line drawn 2 centuries ago between the harbor towns down island and the poorer rural land up island has not been erased. It has only changed hands, real estate listings now doing the sorting that geography once did on its own. The island's year-round population still sits near 24,000. Each summer it swells toward 200,000, all of them ferried across Vineyard Sound on the same boats that have carried passengers back and forth for generations. A tribal nation that has stewarded this land for thousands of years now shares it with a shrinking population of teachers, nurses, and tradespeople who keep the island running and can no longer afford to live on it. They are ferried in for shifts and ferried home at night, crossing the same water the whaling fortunes once crossed in the other direction, outbound and full. On the bluffs above Aquina, where the relocated light now turns, a few vines of wild grape still climb low through the beach plum and scrub oak. Their leaves are small and dust-colored, and in the flat light of late afternoon, they throw almost no shadow at all. Bartholomew Gosnold named this island for a harvest he found growing wild on these same bluffs, and for a daughter who never lived to see it. 4 centuries later, the vines have thinned to a tangle nobody bothers to pick, while the ground around them has been surveyed, subdivided, and sold by the foot. The grapes are still there. No one comes for them anymore.